Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello everyone, welcome to the fifth lecture of this massive open online course on Sociology of Development. We are in the second week of this course. As you know that this is a 30-hour course spanning over 12 weeks. This is the second week and in this week we have already discussed, we are discussing end of colonialism, rise of nationalism in the third world and the desire for development. Okay? And in the first two lectures of this course, we have discussed as there was the invention of underdevelopment, how development as a metaphor and its distorted history has been colonial in intent, okay, conceptual inflation, expanding the reign of scarcity, new commons, and the call that Gustavo Esteva wants to have. Okay? And in this lecture, we are going to discuss ideologies of Western dominance and ideologies of modernization. Decolonization, the Cold War and nation building, it has been divided into two parts, two phases. One is immediately after the Second World War, 1945 to 1960, and then 1960 to 1975. Precisely because of when modernization, that there was a decline of popularity for modernization theory and the height of the Cold War. And then rise of Asian studies, emergence of Southeast Asian studies and military modernization theory and nation building. Okay? Now let us start with ideologies of Western dominance and ideologies of modernization. Michael Adès, in his important study of ideologies of dominance, questions the idea that the influential theories of modernization that emerged during the late colonial and early Cold War periods were primarily new concepts created to counter the appeal of communism in the underdeveloped world. And I am drawing this from Michael Adès. Michael Adès's important work on machines as the measure of men, science, technology and ideologies of Western dominance. Okay? Although the theories of modernization of the Cold War era were recast in development jargon, they were grounded in ideas which were deeply rooted in the historical experience of Western Europe on the one hand and North America on the other. Similarly, you will find Michael E. Latham's work on modernization as ideology, American social science and nation building in the Kennedy era, that you will find that Latham's innovative examination of ideologies of modernization parallels Michael Adès' machines as the measure of men, and concludes that contrary to the arguments of their advocates, those theories that emerged in the 1950s and early 1960s were neither decisive intellectual breakthroughs nor completely new political initiatives. While the basic assumptions of these emergent theories of modernization were clearly grounded in the culture of Cold War North America, modernization theorists also reframed earlier imperial ideals in order to tell the United States of America who they were and to clarify what the projection of US power could achieve. And modernization theory, the way it tried to distinguish between backward and advanced regions and tried to establish the American hegemonic position. Okay? Decolonization, end of colonialism, okay? Decolonization, the universalization of the nation state and the Cold War provided the crucial backdrop for the rise and elaboration of modernization theory and closely related theories of political development and nation building that were centered on direct or indirect US involvement in the formation and consolidation of stable anti-communist national political systems. After 1945, what we generally find that the nation state became the central and unquestioned unit of study for modernization theorists and the natural object of a burgeoning number of exercises in state mediated national development and nation building. At the same time, modernization theory and theories of nation building exercised a profound influence on and were bound up with the rise and transformation of area studies in general and Asian studies in particular. Okay? You may say Asian studies, somebody may say African studies, somebody may say Latin American studies, because these three continents, they challenged the orthodoxy and obscurantism of modernization theory. Okay? The dominant narratives within Asian studies between the 1940s and the 1970s emphasized the need for the various nation states of Asia to develop gradually towards a relatively universal form of capitalist modernity. Modernization theorists, the proponents of modernization theory, sometimes conceived of the new nations in ways that at least implicitly acknowledged that they were historically constructed and contingent, but their work generally treated these countries as natural units that could or at least ought to evolve along a single path or at best a limited number of paths towards modernity or capitalist modernity. And meanwhile, the use of political models and lessons with little or no regard for questions of time and space further undermined modernization theories' relationship to the temporal and spatial specificity of the formation, consolidation or collapse of the new nation states. Okay. While the modernization theory played a key role in the consolidation and routinization of the idea of political and economic development as national development after 1945, Asia, Africa and Latin America occupied a particularly important position in the study of modernization by North American social scientists in the 1950s and 1960s as a project of European enlightenment. Okay? And that is how they wanted to colonize. Okay? This is modernization theory is a colonial product. Okay? The concern with nation building and national development at the center of modernization theory was linked to a number of major trends specific to the period from the 1940s to the 1970s. And the idea of national development after 1945, I mean after the Second World War, involved the representation and promotion of Western European and North American measures of political, social and economic progress as increasingly universal and national solutions. That is how military prowess was also imposed upon, on the rest of the population by the North American continent and Western European world. Although many of these approaches had their origins in the 19th and early 20th centuries, a number of them were only consolidated in Western Europe on the one hand and North American continent on the other, along with parts of Latin America, Central Europe and Japan in the 1930s or even the 1940s. After 1945, these formulations increasingly involved a universal emphasis theoretically on the national economy and national industrialization, as well as agrarian reform and agro-industrialization and a privileging of the role of the national government or state in the management of economic development. In a wider sense, national development increasingly involved, again in theory, a social democratic emphasis on education, health care and other public institutions, I mean social security measures to facilitate social advance and the incorporation of the majority of the population into the process of national development. And this emphasis was also readily apparent, albeit in significantly different ways, in the state socialist versions of national development that emerged with the growing influence of the People's Republic of China and the erstwhile USSR, I mean Soviet Union, an influence that the North American proponents of national development sought explicitly to challenge. With the onset of the Cold War in the late 1940s, the United States of America was increasingly animated by a commitment to construct an open world economy while promoting state mediated national development as part of its wider effort to contain the erstwhile Soviet Union and its allies, I mean to contain the socialist countries' influence on the economy. The hegemonic position of the United States of America in the nation state system as it was consolidated during the Cold War still bore significant traces of the colonialism and imperialism practiced by the European powers and Imperial Japan as well as the United States of America. Despite continuities, what we generally find that the American and Soviet Cold War empires departed in important ways from earlier colonial or imperial projects. Most significantly, you will find in political and administrative terms, both countries, I mean US as well as the erstwhile USSR, presided over empires made up more or less entirely of formally independent and sovereign nation states rather than colonies. The role of the US in Latin America by the early 20th century and the role of Britain in Latin America as well as Britain and France in the Middle East after the First World War had foreshadowed this new form of international power. In the Cold War era, the relationship between the respective superpowers and their allies, I mean North American continent on the one hand and the erstwhile Soviet Union on the other, and their supporters, respective supporters and their allies, was increasingly mediated by complex systems of military alliances, regional organizations and new international institutions such as the United Nations, all of which involved formal agreements between ostensibly sovereign nation states. And this represented an important departure from earlier forms of imperialism and colonialism. That is why the geopolitical and geoeconomic framework of the Cold War was thus central to national development as a universal ideal. Okay. After 1945, the United States of America and the Soviet Union presided over a growing system of alliances and disbursed large quantities of economic and military aid to the developing nations of the Third World. The IMF and the World Bank as well as the United Nations also played a growing role in promoting national development. Okay? And that's how they also created debt-ridden economies, and India is no exception to this. India has also become a debt-ridden economy under the IMF World Bank regime. Okay? In this context, the idea of development or modernization as both process and ultimate goal increasingly permeated nationalist narratives worldwide. Most importantly, the global spread of nationalism and national sentiments involved the universalization in theory of the idea of the equality of all nations and of all citizens within all nations. The idea of nationhood carried with it a commitment, at least in the abstract, to democracy. Okay, that this kind of nationalist narratives, they visualized equality, democracy, human rights, and universal suffrage. I mean the voting pattern, universal adult franchise, universal adult suffrage. The United Nations Charter explicitly envisioned a global community of formally equal nation states that were expected to observe the democratic sentiments expressed in that charter, as well as a range of conventions on human rights. By the 1980s, nevertheless, the diverse and often profoundly flawed versions of national development that had emerged or had been consolidated, and in some cases such as South Vietnam had already disappeared over the previous 30 or 40 years, were increasingly challenged by the emergent globalization project. In India, you will also find that we also entered the phase of liberalization, privatization and globalization in early 90s in the context of debacle, in the context of the debacle of socialism in the erstwhile USSR, and the end of the Cold War and the establishment of a single hegemonic position that North American continent exercised. Okay, and in this context, with an increased emphasis on global economic integration and economic liberalism, globalization compounded the previous failures of national development and nation building, while also introducing new problems. This trend was accelerated and clarified by the end of the Cold War. And in this lecture, what I intend to do to explore the rise and transformation of theories of modernization and ideas of nation building after the Second World War and their relationship to US foreign policy, with an emphasis on Asia and in general and India in particular. Okay? And that is why when I said ideologies of Western dominance and ideologies of modernization, the impact, the influence of the ideologies of Western dominance, ideologies of modernization on Asia in general and India in particular. That is why the first phase that we are trying to discuss here, how modernization theory was subject to revision in the 1960s and early 1970s in the context of growing challenges to its explanatory and normative or prescriptive aspirations. An important reorientation was the move away from the psychological emphasis of early modernization theory and towards an approach that drew on economics and game theory, what would later become widely known as rational choice theory. And this change has been characterized variously as a shift from constructive counterinsurgency to coercive counterinsurgency. That is why you will find military modernization theory, okay, or from classical theory to military modernization theory. However, it did not involve a dramatic rethinking of the basic assumptions of modernization theorists and US policymakers about Washington's geopolitical and geoeconomic objectives in Asia and Africa and Latin America. That is what we have already discussed, geopolitical and geoeconomic framework of the Cold War. That is why I said it became central to national development as a universal ideal. And that is why you will find that many observers define modernization theory in a way that includes development economics. However, others such as Colin Lees, whose position is reinforced by Gilman's study of the genesis of modernization theory, argue that it is more accurate to view development economics as having provided the earliest systematic formulations of development theory. Generally, while modernization theory is best understood as having appeared in the late 1950s as a particularly North American response to political scientists to the incipient failure of many of the prescriptions of development economists. Other observers prefer to use the term political development theory rather than modernization theory to describe the work by North American political scientists in the late 1950s and 1960s. In the view of, for example, Paul Kamek, political development theory drew heavily upon modernization theory, which he attributes primarily to the sociological tradition running from Max Weber to Talcott Parsons and Edward Sills, but at the same time engaged in a critical dialogue with it. Okay? While political development theory played an important role in the rise and revision of modernization theory, okay, modernization theory can still be seen to encompass conceptions of political, social and cultural change that extend beyond political developments as such. At the same time, development economics should be regarded as an early form of development theory that is distinct from modernization. However, while when you look at the term modernization theory to refer primarily to discussions of political development, it is also used more broadly, as is widely accepted, to describe the growing array of liberal theories of modernization that emerged after 1945 and increasingly reached across the social sciences encompassing political science generally, as well as history, sociology and area studies. This formulation allows the Social Science Research Council's Committee on Comparative Politics which was established in 1954 and became the key site for the production of political development theory. To be seen as an important force behind modernization theory in the 1950s and early 1960s, whether the latter term is defined narrowly or broadly. The founding members of the committee were Pai, you will find, we will discuss Pai, George and others later on, but Pai, Pocker, Cole and others from 1954 to 1963, and this committee on comparative politics provided a key focus for the production and dissemination of modernization theory. It is worth noting that of the 6 founding members, Pai, Pocker and Kahn, did most or all of the work on Southeast Asia. However, while the first two, Pai and Pocker, continued to play a key role in both the committee and government political development theory nexus, Kahn was eased off the committee within a few years of its establishment. From the outset, the Committee on Comparative Politics sponsored a wide range of academic and policy oriented publications, as well as a number of conferences and seminars. Its goal was to articulate a theory of political development. However, over time, many crucial concepts were used inconsistently, and no full-blown theory could be said to have emerged. Despite its scientific aspirations and despite the widespread uses of the term modernization theory, what the committee provided was primarily an outlook or approach rather than a theory per se. It also played an important role in the establishment of acceptable parameters for the professional study of politics. The social scientists, political scientists, the economists associated with the committee were aware that they were engaged in the production of a theoretical alternative to Marxism. Okay? In the early 1980s, for example, a former member asserted that its purpose had been to formulate a non-communist theory of change and thus to provide a non-Marxian alternative for the developing nations. Okay? They wanted to challenge the socialist ideas. That is why, for example, Rostow also wrote the stages of growth. That is a non-communist manifesto that Rostow penned. That is why I said, efforts to generate an alternative theoretical apparatus to Marxism. The desire to generate an alternative theoretical apparatus to Marxism is nicely encapsulated by the committee's efforts to marginalize the concept of the state. Because in Marxist literature that you will find that the state has been accorded a central role in the public policy making, in the efficacy of public institutions. The state is being treated as the most important political institution. Okay? That is why the committee made effort to marginalize the concept of the state. The foundations for such an effort were laid after the First World War, by which time the concept of the state was increasingly displaced and the disciplines within broader social sciences, what we generally find that were consolidated and professionalized around pluralism as both the basis of US politics and the norm by which political theory and practice elsewhere were to be measured. In the 1950s, Gabriel Almont and his fellow scholars avoided using the word state, favoring the term political system, as in their view the former, the state was afflicted with at least two important shortcomings. It was felt to be a vague term for which it was difficult to agree on an exact definition, Moreover, scholars believed that any definition would marginalize or exclude important elements of the political process. They apparently took the view that the dramatic social and political changes which had occurred since the Industrial Revolution meant that identifying the boundaries between the state and society had become ever more difficult. Ultimately, nevertheless, these reasons for avoiding the nation of the state, the notion of the state appear less persuasive than the fact that the Second World War and the Cold War had provided North American political science with a new set of global imperatives. For example, in a 1944 report on the future of comparative politics, Karl Loewenstein argued that the political scientists, social scientists, economists, they should dispense with any narrow focus on the state and become a conscious instrument of social engineering. Instead of the state, or for imparting the US experience to other nations and the scientific integration of their institutions into a universal pattern of government. He envisioned the emergence of a total science, arguing that the frontier posts of comparative government must be moved boldly to include both the entire world and a range of other academic disciplines which would ensure access to the true gestalt of foreign political civilizations. For example, in 1953, David Easton argued that the Cold War made it a national and international imperative to clarify the political lexicon, purge the concept of the state and produce general theoretical laws which would encompass all important political activities and transcend specific cultures. That's how there was a battle of ideologies, what we generally find. While modernization theorists sought to find alternatives to the state and articulate a non-Marxian alternative for the hitherto existing colonized nations, the so-called developing nations, underdeveloped economies, they were also attempting, as Easton's comments suggest, to shift anti-communism away from the populist hysteria of the McCarthy era towards a far more scientifically grounded political position. Modernization theory was a high concept version of Americanism that involved materialism without class conflict, secularism without irreverence, democracy without disobedience. Although modernization theory was clearly anti-communist in its political outlook, it rested on a deeper set of assumptions about progress and modernity that in fact overlapped with Marxism. In particular, industrialization and urbanization were central to both liberal and Marxist visions of modernity and national development. Furthermore, modernization theorists acknowledged the modernity of the USSR, though a deviant or pathological version thereof, while hoping that the Soviets would eventually converge with the democratic and capitalist type of modernity exemplified by the United States of America. Ultimately, modernization theory privileged an evolutionary conception of political change and development grounded in a romanticized vision of the history of the United States of America. Early theorists were at least rhetorically committed to democracy, often seeing it as the direct result of economic development and the key to political stability. For instance, James Coleman discerned a positive relationship between economic development on the one hand and competitive democratic political systems on the other. At the same time, this conception of political development was elitist and technocratic, and even in the 1950s, stability was regarded as more important than democracy, an emphasis that would become more pronounced in the 1960s. And in Indian context, even for some time now, perhaps stability is regarded as more important than democracy. Now, there is a battle of conflicting ideologies, competing ideologies, and so on. And what are the implications? What are the implications of such delineation of ideologies of colonialism, Western dominance, ideologies of modernization? I mean, the process of then decolonization, the Cold War, and nation building on the rise of Asian studies and the emergence of Southeast Asian studies. In the 1950s and 1960s, Asian studies generally and the Association for Asian Studies more specifically were strongly influenced by and played a complementary role in the wider US-led modernization project of the Cold War era. The Second World War had brought a large number of academics into direct contact with the American government, providing the foundation for a wave of institutional growth and expansion that began during the conflict, but was facilitated over a much longer period by the Cold War. Historians, political scientists, economists, sociologists established closer links with the US government during the wartime and post-war periods than virtually any other academics except physicists. Of course, you know the Manhattan Project and so on. I mean, Oppenheimer and Einstein, they were engaged in the Manhattan Project. The linkages emerged in a number of ways, and although not all political scientists and historians participated, the senior members of these professions were very fully represented, very well represented. Many academics took up full-time posts with various government agencies, while others did so on a part-time or irregular basis, and many others at the very least consciously allowed wartime and later Cold War imperatives to influence their work. If you look at, I mean that period, meanwhile, the Office of Strategic Services, the forerunner of the Central Intelligence Agencies, was one of the best known postings for political scientists and historians, and one of the most significant for area studies. Okay. Area studies is important. Okay. Whether colonialism, whether imperialism, whether theory of nation building, theory of nationalism, modernity, are they going to work in all regions or not? Okay. That is why area studies is extremely important, because it caters to the need of the specific group of people, questions of identity and so on. Okay. Essence, I mean Asian studies in particular. W. Norman Brown, who is credited with founding and guiding South Asian studies in North America after the Second World War, was employed by the Office of Strategic Services, as was John K. Fairbank, who worked as an information officer at the American Embassy after the US entered the war. Okay. The main North American based professional organization for the study of Asia came into existence in 1948 as the Far Eastern Association and centered around the Far Eastern Quarterly, which had first appeared in 1941. It became the Association for Asian Studies in 1958 shortly after the publication had changed its name to the Journal of Asian Studies. Okay. Although the Asian Studies profession increasingly emerged as a result of US Cold War policies, which it tended to complement, a number of important specialists in the field were badly treated by the government in the 1950s. The reputation of the Institute for Pacific Relations, which had provided an important pre-1945 institutional focus for Asian experts, suffered irreparable damage after the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee concluded that the organization had been instrumental in the so-called loss of China. The tensions surrounding this debate and the Institute for Pacific Relations controversy complicated the emergence of Association of Asian Studies in the 1950s. Okay. For example, Fairbank came under scrutiny in the McCarthy years and did not have a particularly good relationship with the State Department until the 1960s, and in the early 1950s his services as a State Department consultant were discontinued. Okay. Similarly, if you look at area studies, you will find that questions of identity are extremely important. Questions of identity cannot be examined by dissociating the questions of land, the questions of colonialism, the questions of nationalism, the questions of the relationship between labor and capital, and so on. Okay. This is extremely important, and the rising interest in Southeast Asia, when you look at in the context of the growing concern with developing areas generally, is apparent in the work of Pai, also a founding member of the Committee on Comparative Politics. If you look at rise of Asian studies and the emergence of Southeast Asian studies, you will find that it leads to the second phase of the process of decolonization, the Cold War and nation building, I mean 1960 to 1975. The work on nation building by Pai, George and others, other modernization theorists, reflected on the growing concern in the 1960s about the future of the new nations, newly politically independent nations. This intersected with an increased emphasis in American foreign policy circles, symbolized by the election of John F. Kennedy, who sought to revitalize and reorient US anti-communist globalism on the need for a more ambitious nation building strategy. This involved taking the initiative in Asia as well as Latin America, the Middle East and Africa to counter the communist threat via the infusion of increased levels of military and economic aid, advice and support. You will find that that when Rostow, I mean provided this, by the Rostow, who served who served in the research and analysis branch of the Office of Strategic Services during the Second World War, became an advisor to Kennedy, then a senator at the end of the 1950s. He went on to be chair on the policy planning staff in the State Department during the Kennedy administration, as well as an advisor to President Johnson during the Vietnam War. He was appointed National Security Advisor in 1966. Meanwhile, Max Millikan, who was on leave from MIT in the late 1940s and early 1950s in order to serve as Assistant Director of Economic Research at the CIA, Central Intelligence Agency, returned to academia in 1952 to become the Director of CINIS, a position he held until his death in 1969. I mean, why I'm referring to Rostow is extremely important. Here, by the late 1950s, Millikan and Rostow advocated and symbolized the shift in US foreign policy away from containing the Soviet Union with direct military force. At a time when the Soviet Union had begun developing atomic weaponry and towards taking the initiative in Asia, Africa and Latin America via infusions of economic and military aid as part of an increasingly ambitious set of national development and counterinsurgency programs. Rostow's The Stages of Economic Growth in Non-Communist Manifesto of 1960, we have already discussed this in the initial lectures, that what are the stages of economic growth for what the way I mean, what are the stages of economic growth as envisaged by Rostow, Walt Whitman Rostow, that the traditional society, then pre-takeoff, then takeoff, then drive to maturity, and then high mass consumption. And these stages of economic growth were nothing but a non-communist manifesto in 1960, encapsulated more than any other single text the high modernist and anti-communist approach to nation building emanating from Washington in the early 1960s. Rostow argued that communism was a kind of disease which can befall a transitional society if it fails to organize effectively those elements within it which are prepared to get on with the job of modernization. He called on the democratic North to face and deal with the challenge implicit in the stages of growth theory at the full stretch of our moral commitment, our energy and our resources. Okay, that is how Rostow and Millikan, they tried to provide a non-communist manifesto to development policy, development planning. Rostow advocated government planning and state intervention to facilitate the movement of a developing nation through his 5 stages to reach takeoff. However, in contrast to some of the more structuralist proponents of development economics, his approach tended to ignore the hierarchical character of the historical and contemporary contemporary international political economy. Of course, like virtually all development economists, Rostow's approach was ahistorical and technocratic. He took nation states as natural units of a wider international order, while overlooking the numerous historical changes that distinguished the industrialization of emergent nation states in the 18th and 19th centuries from developing nations of the 20th. By the time the stages of economic growth in non-communist manifesto was published, Rostow and Millikan were serving as advisors to Senator Kennedy. In January 1960, the US Senate Committee on Foreign Relations, of which Kennedy was a member, received a report it had commissioned. The title of this was Economic, Social and Political Change in the Underdeveloped Countries and its Implications for United States Policy. The authors expounded the importance of the developing nations for US foreign policy. The report's main recommendations were that American foreign economic aid should be disbursed on a long-term and unlinked basis following clear economic criteria. technical assistance, particularly in agriculture, needed to continue and land reform needed to be promoted. It emphasized that the US needed to coordinate the distribution of aid with other donor governments in the developed world, and that a corps of development professionals should be established. Aid for particular capital intensive projects, it was argued, should be increased and spread over a number of projects to facilitate a big push in the developing nations. A revised and expanded version of the report was published in 1961 and it was edited by Millikan and Blackmer and included chapters by Rostow, Pai and others. And that's how you will find the second phase of decolonization, the Cold War and nation building that we tried to discuss. And the final component that we have in this lecture about military modernization theory and nation building. Okay, I mean, when I said reorientation and revision, what I refer to here, I mean a continued commitment to the search for theories of modernization and strategies of nation building with universal relevance was apparent in the work of a number of modernization theorists in the 1960s and 1970s. Observers have frequently argued that the war in, for example, war in Vietnam provided the backdrop for the consolidation of what is sometimes called the politics of order approach or military modernization theory. In particular, it is often held that a result of an increasing number of challenges to US nation building efforts, the creation of institutions and organizations and structures that could provide order became the key issue for modernization theorists during the 1960s. And in the context of the prominent role of the military in politics in Asia, and beyond this led to growing interest in the military as a modernizing force. Okay. I mean, therein lies the significance of how modernization theory can be reoriented and revised to cater to the needs of the colonizers, okay, to the Western capitalist world on the one hand and North American continent on the other. That's how you will also find that Samuel Huntington, for example, who is the author of The Class of Civilizations, I mean, then The Crisis of Democracy and so on, you will find that how Samuel Huntington is generally seen as one of the most prominent exponents of the shift from classical modernization theory with its psychological orientation and its apparent emphasis on democracy to the politics of order and military modernization theory. A major figure in North American political science, social sciences in general, Huntington began his career in Yale, then Chicago and then Harvard, and then you will find that in 1950s and early 1960s, Huntington wrote about the military in politics. Military in politics. Okay. His reputation as a theorist of political development and modernization, I mean the way he wrote The Soldier and the State, was consolidated with Political Order in Changing Societies, which first appeared in 1968. The book Political Order in Changing Societies, The Soldier and the State, changing patterns of military politics, all of Huntington's works that you will find that they're extremely important in the context of reorientation and revision of military modernization theory and nation building. Okay. Huntington, many of its main ideas and propositions are to be found in earlier books. What Huntington did, however, was to synthesize this earlier work while focusing on predicting what might or might not be necessary to ensure continued political order and social stability. Okay. Huntington held up political order as the ultimate goal of any society, and in an implicit critique of development economics and Cold War policy makers, Huntington argued that contrary to earlier expectations, the instability in Asia and the rest of the Third World since the Second World War was primarily the result of rapid social change and the rapid mobilization of new groups into politics, coupled with the slow development of political institutions. In his view, the US foreign policy since 1945 had missed this point because Washington had focused on the economic gap and ignored the political gap, because of the assumption in North America that political stability flowed from social reform stimulated by economic development. He argued that it was crucially or it was actually the process of modernization that resulted in political instability. For Huntington, organization was the road to political power as well as the foundation of political stability. While the vacuum of power and authority which was seen to exist in so many modernizing countries may be filled temporarily by charismatic leadership or by military force, he contended that it could be only filled permanently by political organization. That is what we also see over a period of time, even in Indian context, that how military modernization theory in the context of the questions of nationalism, nation building and so on. Okay. Coming to diversification and decline that we tend to see so far as military modernization theory and nation building are concerned. I mean, there was a decline for some time, but now it is becoming, I mean, it is gaining momentum in various parts of the world. By the 1970s, what we generally find that the elaboration of military modernization theory and the politics of order approach was part of a much wider process of diversification and decline in modernization theory as various new radical and moderate theoretical challengers emerged. This process influenced the emergence of the concept of bureaucratic authoritarianism associated initially with the work of O'Donnell. This theory had gained some prominence by the 1970s. O'Donnell argued that in late industrializing nation states, economic development intersected with the end of democracy and greater rather than less inequality. His approach drew on Weberian sociology and Marxism and corporatist concepts. More specifically, he built critically on Huntington's approach and on the early historical critique of modernization theory articulated by Barrington Moore. Central to O'Donnell's analysis was the argument that a bureaucratic authoritarian state emerged when the limits of import substitution industrialization were reached. At this point, the alliance which had been forged between the working class and the national bourgeois broke down, and the latter moved to form an alliance with the military. I mean, national bourgeois moved to form an alliance with the military and the technocracy, resulting in bureaucratic authoritarianism. A central characteristic of bureaucratic authoritarian regime as defined by O'Donnell was that it was an attempt by the bourgeois linked to transnational capital to protect their interests and guide the economy in a direction commensurate with their needs. By the second half of the 1970s, the more deterministic elements of the theory of bureaucratic authoritarianism were being increasingly challenged even by O'Donnell himself, At the same time, it was being used as a relatively open conceptual framework that provided a guide for research more than a verifiable theory. The concept of bureaucratic authoritarianism represented a particularly critical revision of modernization theory that went much further than Huntington in the way it incorporated insights from Marxist and Marxist derived theories. Although its primary impact was on Latin American studies, bureaucratic authoritarianism had a broad influence on the study of modernization and political development in the Third World. It played a role or was connected to the shift in political science towards bringing the state back in, a shift that had important implications for the analysis of political and economic change in Northeast and Southeast Asia. The shift towards bringing the state back in followed from the diversification of modernization theory generally and more specifically the decline of the Committee on Comparative Politics that we have earlier discussed. If you can slightly recall, we have just now discussed Committee on Comparative Politics. The proposed project on Europe was at least partially an attempt to rejuvenate European political studies via its inclusion in the study of political development in the non-European world. For example, Tilly's study, Charles Tilly, the formation of nation states in Western Europe. Tilly's study was a disappointment for Pai, for example, who was by this point chair of the committee, particularly because of its failure to provide sustenance for the universalizing and ahistorical approach that was the hallmark of political development theory. The book crystallized the tension between political science and history in relation to the study of state formation and nation building, a tension centered on the universal versus the particular. And at the same time, the emphasis on the role of conflict and violence in state formation and in the emergence of nation states in Europe, you will find represented a critique of the evolutionary and organic conception of social change central to modernization theory in general and political development theory in particular. Okay, what we generally we are trying to look at the diversification and decline in this context. We'll try to wrap it up with this note that in the 1950s, modernization theory emerged as the most significant conceptual trend in social sciences in general and area studies in particular. And we are trying to examine the history of that theory from the 1940s to 1970s with a focus on Asia broadly and maybe Asia, Africa and Latin America taken together, emphasizing the ways in which decolonization, the Cold War, the nation building and the growing power of the US were central to the consolidation of the modern idea of political and economic development. One may say modern idea, one may say militaristic idea of economic and political development. While modernization and political development theory played an important role in the formalization of the study of Asia, Africa and Latin America during this period, the dramatic transitions from colonies to nation states in that region and the deepening war in what had been French Indonesia, French Indochina, for example, were in turn pivotal to the rise and transformation of modernization theory. At the same time, a central contradiction of modernization theory and of the wider US sponsored modernization project was the way in which they uncritically took the nation state as the key unit of analysis. The Cold War profoundly conditioned but was also contingent upon the world historical process of decolonization and the universalization of the nation state system. This ensured the theories of modernization and political development and approaches to nation building had important connections with the colonial period